He mocked his wife for standing alone in the divorce hearing, until her father stood up and stopped the judge mid-sentence. Picture this: a packed courtroom on a Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of old wood and stale coffee. A man in an expensive suit sits smugly at the defendant's table, occasionally turning to smirk at the younger woman seated behind him in the gallery. Across the aisle, a woman sits alone, or so it appears. Her hands are folded on the table. Her expression is calm. Too calm. "Your Honor," the man says, voice dripping with condescension. "As you can see, my wife doesn't even have anyone here to support her. No family. No friends. I think that speaks volumes about who really built this life we're dividing today." The courtroom is silent. The judge adjusts his glasses, about to respond. And that's when it happens. A deep voice cuts through the tension from the back of the room. "With permission, Your Honor." Everyone turns. A silver-haired man in an impeccable Navy suit stands slowly, deliberately. The confidence in his posture makes the air itself feel heavier. The smug husband's face drains of color in 3 seconds flat, because he suddenly realizes this isn't just anyone. This is Richard Morrison, Sarah's father, the man whose name appears on half the corporate buildings in this city. The man he dismissed as some retired old guy who plays golf for 15 years. And in the next 30 minutes, everything Michael Harrison thought he knew about his life would be systematically destroyed. But to understand how we got here, to this moment of beautiful, devastating justice, we need to go back to where it all began. Back to the day a young, ambitious man married a woman he thought was lucky to have him. He had no idea she was the only reason he had anything at all. Michael Harrison wasn't born wealthy. He grew up in a middle-class suburb of Indianapolis, the son of a factory worker and a school teacher. He was smart, not brilliant, but smart enough. Ambitious, not visionary, but hungry enough. And most importantly, he was charming. The kind of charming that gets you into rooms you don't belong in and keeps you there just long enough to make an impression. At 27, Michael landed a mid-level position at a marketing firm in Chicago. He wore suits he couldn't quite afford and drove a leased BMW that ate up half his paycheck. He talked big at networking events. He name-dropped. He laughed too loud at his boss's jokes. He was, in every way, a man trying desperately to become someone. And then he met Sarah Morrison at a fundraiser gala. She was 25, elegant in a simple black dress that probably cost more than his monthly rent, though you'd never know it from how she wore it. She wasn't flashy. She didn't talk about money. When Michael approached her with his usual practiced charm, she simply smiled and asked him about his work. She listened, really listened. It was intoxicating. What Michael didn't know, what Sarah never told him, was that she was the only daughter of Richard Morrison, one of the most successful corporate attorneys and investors in the Midwest. Richard had built his fortune quietly, deliberately. He didn't do press. He didn't name buildings after himself unless it was strategic. He invested in people and companies, took his percentage, and moved on. By the time Sarah was born, the Morrison Family Trust was worth tens of millions of dollars. But you'd never know it talking to Sarah. She worked as an art curator at a nonprofit gallery. She drove a modest sedan. She lived in a nice but unremarkable apartment. Her father had raised her with a simple philosophy: let your actions speak, never your wallet. Michael, of course, interpreted her modesty as simplicity. He thought she was just a nice girl with a regular job and a comfortable background. When she mentioned her father was in law and investments, Michael pictured some local attorney with a small practice. He never asked deeper questions. Why would he? He was too busy talking about himself. They dated for 18 months. Michael proposed a ring he'd saved for her. Nothing extravagant, but respectable. Sarah said yes. Her father met Michael exactly twice before the wedding. Once at an initial meet-the-parents dinner and once at a pre-wedding brunch. Both times, Richard was polite but quiet. He asked Michael a few questions about his career, his goals, his values. Michael answered confidently, perhaps too confidently. Richard said little in response, simply nodding occasionally and exchanging glances with his daughter that Michael didn't notice. After that second meeting, Richard pulled Sarah aside. Are you sure about this? Sarah smiled. I love him, Dad. That's not what I asked. I know what I'm doing. Richard studied his daughter's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but remember, you never have to prove anything to anyone, especially not to him. Sarah squeezed her father's hand. I know. The wedding was beautiful. Too beautiful, actually. Michael had budgeted for a modest ceremony at a decent hotel ballroom. What he got was a luxury venue overlooking Lake Michigan, a 5-course dinner prepared by a Michelin-starred catering team, an open bar with top-shelf everything, and a honeymoon package to Bora Bora. When he saw the bills, or rather, when he didn't see the bills because it had already been paid, he asked Sarah about it. My dad insisted on covering it, she said simply. It's what fathers do. Michael's ego absorbed this easily. Well, he's a good guy. I'm glad he's willing to invest in his daughter's happiness. The word invest came naturally to him. Everything was transactional in Michael's world. What Michael didn't know was that the wedding gift also included a down payment on a stunning 3-bedroom penthouse condo in Lincoln Park. Paid in full, actually, not just a down payment. And the title was in Sarah's name alone. Richard had insisted on that. Sarah hadn't argued. She told Michael that her father had help with the down payment, and that she put it in her name for tax reasons. Michael shrugged it off. What did it matter whose name was on the deed? They were married. It was their home, except it wasn't. Not legally. But Michael didn't bother to check. The first year of marriage was smooth. Michael thrived on the stability. He worked long hours, chased promotions, and slowly climbed the corporate ladder. Sarah supported him quietly. She managed the household finances, which Michael was happy to hand off to her. You're better with details, babe. She hosted dinners for his colleagues. She smiled at his work events. She never complained when he came home late or missed anniversaries because of important meetings. But by year 3, something shifted. Michael started making more money. Good money, even. He got promoted to senior account director. His salary jumped. He started talking about his success more at dinners. He'd lean back in his chair and tell stories about deals he closed, campaigns he led, clients he won. I built this career from scratch, he'd say. Nobody gave me anything. I earned it. Sarah would smile and nod. She never corrected him, never pointed out that his biggest client, a tech startup that became his crown jewel account, was introduced to him through a connection her father made. Never mentioned that the loan he took out to invest in a side business that failed within a year was actually money from her trust that she told him was from savings. Never reminded him that every luxury he enjoyed, from the condo to the car to the country club membership, existed because of her. Why didn't she correct him? Maybe because she loved him. Maybe because she believed love meant letting someone have their pride. Maybe because her father had taught her that truly confident people don't need to broadcast their value. Or maybe because some part of her wanted to see if he'd ever figure out on his own. He never did. By year 7, Michael had fully transformed into the man he'd always wanted to be. Or at least, he thought he had. He was vice president at his firm now. He wore custom suits. He drove a Tesla. He played golf at exclusive clubs and drank expensive whiskey at networking events where everyone knew his name. He'd cultivated an image, the self-made success story, the guy who came from nothing and built everything. His colleagues respected him. His clients trusted him. His friends envied him. And his wife, she'd become something like a piece of fine furniture in his life. Beautiful, functional, expected to be there, but not particularly noticed unless something was wrong. Sarah had changed too, though in different ways. She left her curator job to focus on volunteer work and managing investments, her family's investments, though Michael assumed they were theirs. She spent her days researching nonprofits, attending board meetings for charitable foundations, and quietly growing a portfolio that Michael never looked at closely enough to realize had 8 figures in it. She tried to stay connected to her husband. She suggested date nights. She asked about his day and actually listened to the answers. She planned trips. She tried. But Michael was always busy, always networking, always chasing the next deal, the next promotion, the next level. And when he was home, he was distracted, scrolling through his phone, answering emails, half present at best. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," he'd say when she'd ask for more time together. "I'm building something here. This is important." And Sarah would nod and stop pushing. Because what could she say? That the life he was so proud of building was actually built on a foundation she quietly laid? That every advantage he thought he'd earned had been given? That his entire self-made narrative was a fiction? She stayed quiet, but she started documenting. Not consciously at first, just keeping records, organizing files, making sure everything was in order, just in case. By year 10, Michael barely looked at her anymore. Not really. He saw her at breakfast, exchanged pleasantries, and left for work. He came home late, ate the dinner she prepared or ordered in, and disappeared into his home office for hours. On weekends, he played golf with clients. Their conversations became transactional. "Can you pick up my dry cleaning? Did you pay the HOA fees? I need you to host a dinner next Thursday for some VIPs. Sarah did everything he asked. She was a perfect wife. Patient, supportive, invisible. And then, one random Tuesday evening in their 15th year of marriage, everything started to crack. Michael came home at 11 p.m. smelling like perfume. Not Sarah's perfume. Something floral and young and cheap. Sarah was sitting in the living room with a book when he walked in. She looked up. "Late meeting?" she asked calmly. "Yeah," Michael said, barely making eye contact. "Client dinner ran long. You know how it is." She did know. She knew because this was the 4th time this month he'd come home late smelling like someone else. She knew because his credit card statements she managed, showed charges at restaurants he'd never taken her to. She knew because his phone, which he used to leave casually on the counter, was now password protected and always face down. But she didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, she said, "There's leftover pasta in the fridge if you're hungry." "I'm good. Already ate." He walked past her toward the bedroom. "I'm exhausted. Going to bed." Sarah sat in the dim light of the living room for a long time after he left. Her book lay forgotten in her lap. She stared at the Chicago skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, the windows of the penthouse her father had bought, that Michael thought he'd earned. She felt something shift inside her. Not heartbreak, not yet. Just clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop lying to yourself. She pulled out her laptop and started making a folder. She titled it, "Financial Records Morrison Trust." She began compiling documents, property deeds, bank statements, investment portfolios, trust fund documentation, the business loan she'd guaranteed with her own credit, the connections her father had made that built Michael's career, every receipt, every record, every proof that the life Michael Harrison was so proud to belong to her. It took her 3 weeks to gather everything. During those 3 weeks, Michael came home late 7 more times. His phone was always tilted away from her now. He'd started working out suddenly, go to gym at odd hours. He bought new cologne, new clothes. He was humming in the shower. Sarah watched it all with a strange, detached calm. She felt like she was observing a play she'd already read the script for. She knew how this story ended because she'd heard it 1,000 times. The successful husband, the midlife crisis, the younger woman, the wife left behind. Except this time, the ending would be different, because this wife wasn't powerless. She'd just been waiting. One evening, Michael left his tablet on the kitchen counter while he showered. It dinged with a notification. Sarah glanced at it reflexively and saw a text preview on the lock screen. "Last night was amazing. I can't wait to see you again. V. Vanessa." Sarah didn't even have to guess. She'd seen the name on his calendar. Meeting with V at odd hours. Always vague. Always private. Sarah didn't touch the tablet. She didn't confront him when he emerged from the shower, whistling. She simply smiled and asked if he wanted coffee. He said no, grabbed the tablet, and left for an early meeting. That afternoon, Sarah called her father. "Dad, can you recommend a good divorce attorney? I need someone who specializes in high net worth separations. There was a pause on the line. Then Richard's steady voice. Are you sure? I'm sure. All right, I'll make some calls. When do you need to meet with them? As soon as possible. Another pause. Sarah, you know I'm here. Whatever you need. I know, Dad. I've always known. 2 days later, Sarah sat across from Catherine Chun, one of the most aggressive and successful divorce attorneys in Illinois. Catherine listened to Sarah's story, reviewed the documents she'd brought, and leaned back in her chair with a small, satisfied smile. Mrs. Harrison, Catherine said, I'm going to ask you a direct question. What outcome do you want from this divorce? Sarah didn't hesitate. I want what's mine. All of it. And I want him to understand once and for all that he never built anything. I did. Catherine's smile widened. Then we're to get along very well. For the next 6 weeks, while Michael continued his affair obliviously, Sarah and Catherine built a case that was nothing short of a legal masterpiece. They contacted forensic accountants. They pulled property records. They documented every asset, every transaction, every dollar that had flowed through their marriage. And the picture that emerged was devastating. Michael Harrison owned almost nothing. Every major asset was in Sarah's name or tied to her family trust. The condo, the investment accounts. Even the car he drove every day was leased under her credit. Michael had been living a borrowed life for 15 years and never noticed. Meanwhile, Michael's affair intensified. Vanessa was a 28-year-old marketing assistant at his firm. Blonde, energetic, impressed by everything Michael said. She looked at him like he was the most important man in the world. It was intoxicating. It made him feel young again, powerful, desired. He started talking to Vanessa about divorce. My wife and I have been done for years, he told her over drinks at a hotel bar. She's just comfortable, complacent. She doesn't understand ambition. Not like you do. Vanessa nodded sympathetically. You deserve someone who appreciates you. I do, Michael agreed, and I'm going to make it happen. Soon. What Michael didn't know was that Sarah already knew everything. She'd hired a private investigator, recommended by Catherine, who documented every hotel visit, every restaurant, every text message Michael was careless enough to send on company devices. The evidence was overwhelming, but Sarah didn't want to use it yet, not until the perfect moment. That moment came on a Saturday morning in October. Michael walked into the kitchen where Sarah was having coffee and said, without preamble, "We need to talk." Sarah looked up calmly. "Okay." Michael sat down across from her. He'd rehearsed this. "Sarah, I think we both know this marriage hasn't been working for a while. I think it's time we admitted it and moved on." "You want a divorce?" Sarah said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Michael felt relief wash over him. This was going easier than expected. "I think it's best for both of us. We can split things fairly, stay civil, and—" "I agree," Sarah said simply. Michael blinked. "You agree?" "Yes. I'll have my attorney contact yours. We can start proceedings immediately." Michael had expected tears, arguments, pleading. The calm agreement threw him off. "Oh, well, good. That's good. Mature of you." Sarah took a sip of her coffee. "Is there anything else?" "No. I'll have my lawyer reach out next week. Mine will be ready." Michael stood up, feeling strangely deflated. This wasn't how he'd imagined it. He wanted, what? Drama? A fight? Proof that she cared? But this cool acceptance felt almost like an insult, like she didn't even care enough to fight for him. "Fine," he said, and walked out of the kitchen. Sarah sat alone at the table, staring into her coffee. Her hand was shaking slightly, the only outward sign of emotion she'd allowed herself. She took a slow breath and pulled out her phone. She texted Catherine. "He asked for the divorce. Let's proceed." Catherine's response came immediately. "Perfect. Let's destroy him." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Not cruel, not vindictive. Just tired. Tired of being underestimated. Tired of being invisible. Tired of watching a man take credit for a life she'd built. It was time for Michael Harrison to learn what self-made really meant, and the lesson was going to hurt. Michael moved out 2 weeks later, into a luxury apartment he rented using what he thought was his money from their joint account. He immediately started appearing publicly with Vanessa, Instagram posts at expensive restaurants, weekend trips to Miami, a new wardrobe. He was living his best life. He told anyone who'd listen, finally free, finally happy, finally with someone who got him. His friends congratulated him. His colleagues raised eyebrows but said nothing. Everyone assumed Sarah was a victim here, the quiet wife left behind for a younger model. No one knew that Sarah was, at that very moment, sitting in Catherine Chen's office reviewing a 47-page divorce petition that would systematically dismantle every illusion Michael Harrison had ever had about himself. "When should we file?" Catherine asked. Sarah looked at the calendar. "As soon as possible. I want this done before the holidays." Aggressive. "I like it." Catherine paused. "Sarah, you understand that when we file this with the evidence we have, it's going to get ugly. He's going to fight. He's going to be blindsided." "I know. And you're ready for that?" Sarah met Catherine's eyes. "I've been ready for 15 years. I just didn't know it." Catherine nodded slowly, then picked up her phone and began making calls. By the end of the day, the petition would be filed. Within 72 hours, Michael would be served with papers that would shatter his world. The clock was ticking, and Michael Harrison, in his expensive new apartment with his young girlfriend, had absolutely no idea what was about to hit him, but he was about to find out. And when he did, the man who thought he'd built an empire would discover he'd been living in a house of cards all along, and the woman he dismissed as weak, boring, and replaceable, she was the only thing holding it together. And now she was letting go. Michael was having the best morning of his life when it all started to fall apart. It was a Wednesday mid-morning, and he was at a downtown cafe having an overpriced latte with Vanessa before she headed to the office. She was laughing at something he'd said. He couldn't even remember what, just that she'd laughed, and it made him feel like the wittiest man alive. Her hand was on his arm. Her eyes sparkled. Life was good. "Mr. Harrison?" A voice interrupted. Michael looked up to see a woman in a business suit holding a manila envelope. "Yes." "You've been served." She placed the envelope on the table and walked away before he could respond. Vanessa's eyes widened. "What's that?" Michael opened the envelope with the casual confidence of a man who assumed this was a formality. Divorce papers. Expected. Sarah's attorney making it official. Probably a standard 50-50 split proposal. Maybe a request for some alimony he'd graciously agreed to. He'd be generous. That's the kind of guy he was. He pulled out the document and started reading. His expression changed in real time. Confusion. Then disbelief. Then something approaching panic. "What is it?" Vanessa asked. Michael didn't answer. He was staring at a section titled Property and Asset Declaration. According to this document, the condo, the penthouse he'd called home for nearly 15 years, wasn't his. It was entirely in Sarah's name, purchased outright with funds from a Morrison family trust. The car he drove, leased under Sarah's credit. The investment accounts he'd been so proud of growing, opened with capital from Sarah's trust fund, with her name as a primary account holder. Line after line, asset after asset, the document systematically demonstrated that Michael Harrison, successful VP at a major firm, self-made man, and proud provider, owned almost nothing. "This is wrong," Michael muttered. "This is completely wrong." "What's wrong?" Vanessa pressed. Michael's phone was already out. He was calling his attorney. Well, the attorney he retained last week, a guy named Brad who played golf at his club and promised this divorce would be quick and easy. "Brad? Yeah, I just got served. We need to meet. Today. Now." Michael's voice was tight. "No, this can't wait. They're claiming, look, just clear your afternoon. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his latte. "I have to go." "Michael, what's happening?" Vanessa looked worried now. "Nothing. Just Sarah's playing games. Her lawyer's trying to scare me. It's a tactic. We'll straighten it out." He kissed her forehead distractedly. "I'll call you later." He left her sitting at the cafe, confusion and concern clouding her pretty features. But Michael didn't notice. He was too busy rereading the document as he walked to his car, his brain refusing to process what he was seeing. This had to be a mistake, some clerical error. Maybe Sarah's lawyer was incompetent and filed the wrong paperwork, because the alternative, that everything in this document was true, was impossible. He'd built this life. He'd earned everything. This was a success story, wasn't it? Brad's office was all dark wood and leather furniture, the kind of place designed to make clients feel like they were in capable hands. Michael had felt confident choosing him. Brad was a guy's guy, straightforward, no nonsense. They understood each other. But when Michael burst into Brad's office waving the divorce petition, Brad's expression was more concerned than Michael had expected. "All right, let me see it," Brad said, taking the document. He read in silence for several minutes while Michael paced. Finally, Brad looked up, and his expression was grave. "Michael, how much do you know about your wife's finances?" "What do you mean?" "We have joint finances. Joint accounts, shared assets." "Do you?" Brad flipped through pages. "According to this, nearly every major asset in your marriage is either solely in her name or part of family trust she's the beneficiary of. The penthouse, the investment portfolio, even the credit lines that back several of your purchases. It's all hers." "That's impossible. I've been paying the mortgage on that condo for years." Brad checked the document. "There is no mortgage. The property was purchased outright in 2011. Full payment, no loan. Do you have documentation showing you contributed to the purchase?" Michael opened his mouth and closed it. He'd never actually seen the closing documents. Sarah had handled all that. She said her father helped with the down payment. I assumed I was paying the mortgage through our joint account. "And the joint account? Who funds it?" "We both do. My salary goes into it, and—" Michael trailed off, suddenly realizing he'd never actually tracked where Sarah's contributions came from. "She manages the finances. I just assumed." "Michael," Brad's tone was gentle but firm, "I need to ask you a difficult question. Do you have proof of ownership or contribution for any of the assets listed here?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Michael's mind raced through 15 years of marriage, trying to remember closing documents he'd signed, property titles he'd reviewed, investment accounts he'd opened. The harder he thought, the more he realized. He'd signed where Sarah told him to sign. He'd trusted her to handle the details while he focused on his career. Because she was good at that stuff. Because he was busy. Because— "Oh, God," Michael whispered. Brad nodded slowly. "I think we need to request a continuance and do some serious investigating into the marital assets. But, Michael, I'm going to be honest with you. If what's in this document is accurate, you don't have much of a case for asset division. But we're married. Illinois is a shared property state. For assets acquired during the marriage, yes. But if the property was purchased before marriage or with separate, non-marital funds, like a family trust, it remains separate property. And if she can prove she's been the primary financial contributor throughout the marriage," Brad spread his hands apologetically, "you might be entitled to some spousal support, but that's about it." "Spousal support? From my wife?" Michael's voice cracked. "I'm the one with the career. I'm the VP. She's been volunteering and managing investments." "Her investments," Brad corrected quietly. "Michael, what does Sarah's father do?" "He's some retired lawyer. Does some investing or something." Brad pulled out his phone and typed quickly. He turned the screen toward Michael. It was a Wikipedia page. Richard Morrison, founder of Morrison Capital Partners. Estimated net worth, $280 million. Specialized in early-stage tech investments and corporate law. Retired from active practice in 2009, but maintains board positions on 16 major corporations. Notable clients include— "Stop," Michael said. The room felt too hot, suddenly. "That's— Sarah's dad is that Richard Morrison? You didn't know?" "She never—" Michael sat down hard. "She drives a Honda. She worked at some nonprofit gallery. She's just normal. Her father is worth $250 million, and you thought his daughter was just normal?" Brad shook his head. Michael, I think you've been significantly underinformed about your wife's background and resources. The full weight of it was starting to hit Michael. 15 years. 15 years of living in a penthouse he didn't own, driving cars he didn't pay for, leveraging connections he thought he'd earned but had actually been given. Every dinner party where colleagues complimented his beautiful home, not his home. Every networking event he'd attended at exclusive clubs, memberships paid for by Sarah's trust. Every investment he thought he'd been savvy enough to grow started with Sarah's money. How do I fight this? Michael asked, and he hated how small his voice sounded. Brad was quiet for a moment. Truthfully, you probably can't. Not if the documentation backs up everything in this petition. Your best bet is to negotiate for a small settlement, maybe short-term spousal support, and move on. A small settlement? Brad, I've built a life. I have standards to maintain. I can't just... Michael. Brad's tone was sharp now. You need to understand something. If this goes to court and everything in this document is verified, you're going to look very, very bad. A man who lived off his wife's family money while taking credit for success, then left her for a younger woman. Illinois judges don't look kindly on that, especially not when the wife has documentation. And you have... What do you have? Silence. Exactly, Brad said. So we can fight this, rack up legal fees you probably can't afford given your actual financial situation, and lose publicly. Or we can negotiate quietly, get you something small, and you can rebuild. Michael felt nauseous. Give me a few days. I need to think. Don't take too long. Her attorney is Catherine Chun. She's not known for patience. Michael left the office in a daze. He sat in his car, his leased under Sarah's credit card, for 20 minutes, staring at nothing. His phone buzzed. A text from Vanessa. Hey, babe, everything okay? You seemed upset earlier. He didn't respond. Instead, he opened his banking app. He looked at the joint checking account he'd been using to pay for his new apartment, his dinners with Vanessa, his new wardrobe. Current balance, $47,000. He'd thought of it as their money, but scrolling through the transaction history, he saw something that made his stomach drop. The major deposits didn't come from his paycheck. They came from automatic transfers from an account labeled Morrison Trust Monthly Distribution. His paycheck, his VP's salary that he'd been so proud of, barely covered half their monthly expenses. The rest? All Sarah. Always Sarah. How had he never noticed? Michael did what any man in denial does when faced with devastating reality. He doubled down on the facade. He took Vanessa to an expensive steakhouse that night, ordering a $200 bottle of wine and insisting on an appetizer sampler. He laughed too loud. He told stories about his deals at work, his successes, his plans for the future. Once this divorce is finalized, we can really start our life together, he told Vanessa, reaching across the table for her hand. Maybe get a place together. Something modern downtown. I'm thinking a high-rise with a view. Vanessa smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Michael, is everything okay? With the divorce, you seemed really stressed this morning. Just lawyer stuff. Sarah's trying to play hardball, but she'll realize soon enough that she can't push me around. He took a large gulp of wine. I built the life we had. She just lived in it. The court will see that. Vanessa nodded slowly, but she was starting to wonder. Over the past few weeks, she'd noticed small things. Michael always paid for their dates in cash or on credit cards, never directly from a bank account. He'd mentioned several times that his assets were tied up in investments that were complicated to liquidate. He'd been vague about where exactly he was getting money for the new apartment. She'd assumed he was just being financially conservative during a divorce. But something in his eyes tonight, something desperate and defensive, made her uncomfortable. I'm sure it'll work out, she said carefully. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah was having a very different kind of evening. She was at her father's house, a modest but beautiful brownstone in Lincoln Square, the kind of place that whispered money rather than shouted it. They were having dinner together, just the two of them, like they used to when she was younger. How are you feeling? Richard asked, cutting into his salmon. Sarah considered the question. Lighter, she said finally. Like I've been holding my breath for 15 years, and I'm finally exhaling. Richard nodded. Catherine says a petition was served this morning. I know. His attorney already requested a meeting to discuss asset clarification. Sarah smiled wryly. I don't think Michael knew about any of it. The trust, the properties, how much you're actually worth. He thought you were just some regular retired lawyer. I did try to tell him at that first dinner that I specialize in corporate acquisitions and venture capital. He wasn't listening. He was too busy talking about himself. They ate in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Richard said, You know I would have intervened sooner if you'd asked. I know, but I needed to make the decision myself. To leave because I chose to, not because you pushed me to. And now I want what's mine. And I want him to understand that he never earned anything, that every success he's so proud was built on my foundation. Richard studied his daughter's face. There was no anger there, no vindictiveness, just a quiet, steely determination. He'd raise her well. She wasn't doing this out of spite. She was doing it out of self-respect. Catherine is the best, Richard said. She'll make sure you're protected. I know. Sarah paused. Dad, can I ask you something? That first dinner with Michael, when he was going on and on about his career ambitions and his 5-year plan, you saw through him, didn't you? Richard set down his fork carefully. I saw a young man with more confidence than wisdom, but I also saw that you loved him, or thought you did, and I trusted you to figure it out on your own timeline. Did you ever like him? No, Richard said simply. But that didn't matter. You did, or you thought you did. I think I loved the idea of being normal, of having a regular marriage with a regular guy who didn't know about the money. I thought it would be simpler. How'd that work out? Sarah laughed, a real laugh. Turns out, marrying someone who thinks he's better than you because he doesn't know you're rich is not actually simpler. Lesson learned. Lesson learned. They finished dinner, and as Sarah was leaving, Richard hugged her at the door. I'm proud of you, he said quietly, for knowing your worth. Finally, Sarah drove home to the penthouse, her penthouse, and walked through rooms that suddenly felt bigger, emptier, but somehow more hers than they'd ever been when Michael lived there. She stood at the window, looking out at the city lights, and allowed herself to feel what she'd been suppressing for months. Anger. Not rage. Not hatred. Just anger. Clean, justified, energizing anger. At Michael for taking credit. For diminishing her. For making her feel small in a life she'd built. For leaving her for someone younger and thinking she'd just accept it quietly. She pulled out her phone and texted Catherine. No settlement. I want a trial. Catherine's response came quickly. Are you sure? Trials are public. Messy. Sarah typed back. I want him to hear it in open court. Every detail. I want witnesses. I want it on record. He needs to know. Understood. I'll file our response tomorrow. This is going to get interesting. Sarah set down her phone and smiled. Not a cruel smile. Just satisfied. Michael had wanted a divorce. He was going to get one. Just not the kind he expected. Over the next 3 weeks, as both legal teams prepared for battle, Michael's life began to unravel in slow motion. It started with small things. His credit card, his personal card, separate from the joint account, got declined at a gas station. When he called to inquire, they informed him the card had been linked to a credit line that was being closed. The credit line, it turned out, had Sarah listed as a co-signer and primary account holder. Then his gym membership was canceled. Then his country club access. Then the lease on his Tesla came up for renewal, and he discovered it had been paid through Sarah's account, which was no longer funding his expenses. Each discovery was like a small death. Every luxury, every convenience, every symbol of success he'd taken for granted, all of it was connected back to Sarah. He'd been living in a web of financial dependencies he'd never noticed, because he'd never had to think about where money came from. It just appeared, because Sarah made it appear. Vanessa started noticing, too. Michael had moved from the temporary luxury apartment to a much more modest one-bedroom in a less trendy neighborhood. His excuses were vague. Cash flow issues during divorce. Temporary relocation of assets. But Vanessa wasn't stupid. She started Googling. What she found shocked her. Richard Morrison wasn't just some retired lawyer. He was a titan. And his daughter, the woman Vanessa had dismissed as a boring, dumpy housewife based on Michael's descriptions, was quietly powerful in her own right. There were photos from charity galas, Sarah in elegant gowns, always in the background but always present at events that required serious money to attend. Articles mentioning the Morrison Family Trust funding art installations, education programs, medical research. This wasn't some abandoned housewife. This was a woman who'd chosen to live modestly, while literally funding her husband's illusions. Michael. Vanessa said one evening at his new, significantly less impressive apartment, "How much is your wife actually worth?" Michael, who had been drinking more lately, looked up from his laptop, where he was reviewing legal documents. "What? Why?" "I Googled her dad. Michael, he's worth hundreds of millions. So what? That's his money, not hers. But she's his only child, and you've been married to her for 15 years. And you're telling me you didn't know?" Michael's jaw tightened. Sarah lives a modest life. She never acted like. Or maybe you never paid attention. Vanessa's voice was soft but pointed. "Michael, did you own anything in that marriage?" "Actually own." The question hung between them. Michael wanted to lie, wanted to spin some version of reality where he was still the successful, self-made man she'd fallen for. But he was tired, so tired, and the truth was becoming impossible to deny. "No," he said finally. "Apparently I didn't." Vanessa was quiet for a long moment. "So, when you told me you built this amazing life, you meant you built it, and you lived in it." "That's not fair. I worked hard. I have a career." "A career your wife's father helped you get connections for. I looked into that too. Your biggest client? The one you're always bragging about? Introduced to you through Richard Morrison." Michael's face flushed red. "Who the hell do you think you are, investigating me?" "Someone who's trying to understand what you got into." Vanessa shot back. "You told me your wife was this dependent, simple woman who didn't appreciate you. Turns out she was bankrolling your entire life while you were..." "What?" "Playing pretend." "Get out." "What?" "Get out." Michael's voice rose. "This is my apartment, and I don't need some 20-something telling me about my own life." Vanessa grabbed her purse, eyes shining with tears. "You know what? She's not the one who didn't appreciate what she had. You are." She walked to the door, then paused. "Good luck with the divorce, Michael. I think you're going to need it." The door slammed. Michael stood alone in his cramped one-bedroom, breathing hard, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and IKEA furniture that was a far cry from the custom pieces in the penthouse. He looked around at what his life had become and felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. Fear. Real, actual fear that he was about to lose everything. And worse. The dawning realization that he never had anything to lose in the first place, because nothing had ever been his. His phone buzzed. An email from Brad, his attorney. Subject, court date scheduled. Michael opened it with shaking hands. The trial was set for 6 weeks from now. Catherine Chun had rejected every settlement offer. She was pushing for a full trial. Brad's email ended with a warning. "Prepare yourself. This is going to be public and painful. Chen's team has documentation of every asset, every transaction, every connection. They're building a narrative that you were financially dependent on your wife throughout the marriage. We need to find counter evidence, or you need to seriously consider accepting whatever settlement they might still be willing to offer." Michael deleted the email. Then he poured himself a whiskey. Then another. He sat on his cheap couch in his mediocre apartment and thought about the courtroom, where in 6 weeks his entire life would be dissected in front of strangers, where Sarah would sit across from him with her expensive attorney and her documented evidence and her quiet, devastating truth. He'd wanted a divorce. He'd wanted freedom. He'd wanted to start fresh with someone who appreciated him. But what he was going to get was a reckoning. And for the first time in his life, Michael Harrison realized he might not be the hero of this story. He might actually be the villain. The weeks crawled by. Michael went through the motions at work, but his performance suffered. He was distracted, anxious, short-tempered. His colleagues noticed. His boss pulled him aside for a concerned conversation about his recent work quality. Michael reassured him everything was fine, just some personal stress. Nothing to worry about. But everything was not fine. Michael was drowning, and there was no lifeline in sight. He'd burned his bridge with Vanessa. His friends were sympathetic but distant. They'd all liked Sarah, and word was spreading about the divorce details. His finances were a disaster. His reputation was eroding. And in 3 weeks, he'd have to face Sarah in court, where her attorney would systematically prove that Michael Harrison, vice president, self-made success story, accomplished businessman, was none of those things. He was a man who borrowed someone else's life and mistaken it for his own. The trial was coming, and Michael was terrified. But Sarah was ready. She'd been preparing for this for months. And she was going to make sure that when it was over, there would be no doubt, no ambiguity, no room for Michael to spin another version of reality where he was the victim or the hero. The truth was going to come out. All of it, in open court on the record, undeniable. And it was going to destroy him. 3 weeks before the trial, Michael made a decision born of desperation. He would try to talk to Sarah directly. Maybe if he could just explain, could just make her understand that he loved her, hadn't he? That this didn't have to be so adversarial. They could settle this quietly. Like adults. The fact that he'd left her for another woman, humiliated her socially, and lived off her money for 15 years while taking full credit for his success apparently didn't factor into his calculation of what reasonable looked like. He showed up at the penthouse, his old home, on a Saturday afternoon. He'd timed it deliberately, knowing Sarah usually did her grocery shopping around this time. He'd kept his key, though he knew he probably wasn't supposed to use it. But desperate times call for desperate measures. He let himself in. The place looked different, lighter somehow. Sarah had rearranged some furniture, removed some of his things, added fresh flowers to the dining table. It looked like a home where someone was healing, not grieving. That stung more than Michael wanted to admit. Michael? Sarah's voice came from the hallway. She emerged carrying grocery bags, and her expression shifted immediately from surprise to cold disapproval. What are you doing here? I still had my key. I thought we could talk. You thought wrong. You need to leave. Sarah, please. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. She set down the groceries deliberately, then crossed her arms. You broke into my home. It's not breaking in if I have a key. You broke in, she continued, voice icy, after serving me with divorce papers, after parading your mistress around town, after trying to claim assets that were never yours. And now you want to talk. Do you hear yourself? I know you're angry. I'm not angry, Michael. I'm done. There's a difference. Just listen. Michael moved closer, hands out in a placating gesture. This doesn't have to go to trial. We can settle this. I'll be reasonable about assets. We can split things fairly. Fairly? Sarah's laugh was sharp. You want to split things fairly. Tell me, Michael, what exactly do you think you're entitled to? I was your husband for 15 years. I worked hard. I contributed to our household. You contributed nothing. Sarah's voice was quiet, but absolute. You lived in my home. You drove cars on my credit. You attended events through my family's connections. You built a career on introductions my father made. Your entire life for the past 15 years was subsidized by me, and you never once acknowledged it. Not once. That's not true. I earned my position. I worked 80-hour weeks at a company that hired you because Richard Morrison called a favor. Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled. Do you want to hear the email? I have it. My father wrote to CO. I have a young man, newly married to my daughter, who needs an opportunity. Bright, ambitious, rough around the edges. Could you find a place for him? You got that job because of me, Michael. Your first promotion came after you closed the Henderson account. An account you only got a meeting with because I introduced you to Patricia Henderson at a charity gala. Should I go on? Michael's face had gone pale. You're twisting everything, making it sound like what? Like the truth. Sarah stepped closer, and there was steel in her eyes. For 15 years, I let you have your delusion. I let you play the self-made man. I never corrected you when you told our friends about your empire. I smiled when you talked about providing for us. I stayed quiet because I thought if I loved you enough, you'd eventually see me. Really see me. But you never did you? Sarah, you saw a backdrop, a supporting character, someone to manage your dry cleaning, and host your dinners and maintain the life you thought you'd earned. Her voice cracked slightly. Do you know how lonely that is? To be invisible to the person who's supposed to know you best. For just a moment, Michael saw it. The hurt beneath the anger. The years of being overlooked. And he felt something that might have been guilt. But it was quickly overridden by defensiveness. I'm sorry you felt that way, he said, in the tone of someone who's been coached on how to apologize without actually accepting blame. But I can't change the past. I'm trying to move forward reasonably. If you just agree to mediation instead of this trial. No. Sarah, be practical. A trial is going to cost both of us money, time, emotional energy. I have plenty of money. I have plenty of time. And the emotional energy I'm spending on this, it's worth it. Sarah moved to the door and opened it. Leave. Now. And give me your key. Sarah. Now, Michael. Or I call the police and report a break-in. Michael realized she meant it. He pulled the key from his pocket and dropped it on the entryway table with more force than necessary. You're making a mistake. You're going to regret dragging this out. The only thing I regret is not doing this 10 years ago. Michael left, and Sarah closed the door behind him. She stood there for a long moment, breathing carefully, willing herself not to shake. That was harder than she'd expected. Seeing him in her space again, hearing his voice, his excuses, his refusal to take accountability. But she'd meant every word. This was going to trial, and he was going to hear, in detail, exactly what kind of man he'd been. Catherine Chen's office had become something of a war room, filing cabinets full of documented evidence, a timeline spanning 15 years on a whiteboard, character witnesses ready to testify, financial experts prepared to walk through every transaction, even a private investigator's report on Michael's affair with Vanessa, though Catherine wasn't sure they'd need to use it. The financial evidence alone is devastating, Catherine told Sarah during one of their final prep meetings. But I want to make sure you're prepared for what this is going to feel like. Trials aren't like TV. They're tedious. Michael's attorney is going to try to make you look cold, calculating, like you deliberately tricked him. I didn't trick him. I just didn't correct his assumptions. That's what we'll argue. But Brad, Michael's lawyer, he's going to paint a picture of a wealthy woman who seduced a working-class man, let him think they were building a life together, then pulled the rug out when she got bored. That's absurd. It is, but it's a narrative. And Brad's job is to make the judge sympathetic to Michael. Catherine leaned forward. Sarah, I need to ask you one more time. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this? We can still settle. We can get you everything you're entitled to without the public spectacle. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Catherine, when my father taught me about business, he told me something I've never forgotten. He said, let your actions speak, never your wallet. I've lived by that my whole life. I never flaunted the money, never corrected people's assumptions. I thought it made me humble. But I realize now, sometimes staying quiet isn't humble. It's just letting other people write your story wrong. She looked Catherine in the eye. I want the correct story on record. I want a judge to hear exactly what happened, what I contributed, what Michael took for granted, not for revenge, for the record, so that when this is over, there's no ambiguity, no room for him to spin it to his friends, his colleagues, his next girlfriend. The truth, documented, undeniable. Catherine smiled slowly. All right then, let's give you your day in court. Over the next 2 weeks, they refine their strategy. They present the financial evidence first, the boring but irrefutable numbers that prove Sarah's ownership of assets. Then they bring in the human element, witnesses who'd seen Michael take credit for Sarah's contributions, friends who'd heard him belittle her, business associates who knew about Richard's interventions on Michael's behalf. It would be a comprehensive dismantling of Michael's self-made narrative. Meanwhile, Michael's preparation was going less smoothly. Brad had told him repeatedly, "We don't have much. Our best strategy is to argue that regardless of whose money it was legally, you contribute to marriage in other ways and deserve compensation." What other ways? Michael had asked. Brad had struggled to answer. Emotional support? Partnership? We'll figure it out. But they both knew it was weak. Michael had worked long hours, yes, but at a job Sarah's father helped him get. He'd been present in the marriage, technically, but distracted, dismissive, eventually unfaithful. He contributed to household decisions, except Sarah had made most of them and he'd barely noticed. What could they actually point to as Michael's valuable contribution to the marriage? What if I testify about how hard I worked? Michael suggested desperately. They'll counter with evidence that your career was built on Sarah's connections. What if I talk about how Sarah never told me about the trust fund? Then you look either incredibly unobservant or deliberately ignorant. Neither is a good look. Michael slumped in his chair. So what do I do? Brad sighed. Honestly, prepare for the possibility that you're going to lose badly. And when you do, accept it with dignity so the judge doesn't hate you even more. It wasn't what Michael wanted to hear, but it was the truth. The night before the trial, Sarah had dinner with her father again. It had become their routine over the past few months. Weekly dinners where they talked about everything and nothing, rebuilding a relationship that had been somewhat neglected during her marriage. "How are you feeling?" Richard asked as they sat down to homemade lasagna. Richard had always been a surprisingly good cook. "Strangely calm," Sarah admitted. "I thought I'd be nervous. But mostly I just feel ready. Catherine says it's going to be a long day. Possibly 2 days. I know. She's prepared me." Sarah took a bite of food, then set down her fork. "Dad, can I ask you something? Tomorrow, will you be there? In the courtroom?" Richard looked at his daughter carefully. "Do you want me to be?" Yes. But not sitting behind me. I don't want Michael to know you're there. Not at first." "Where do you want me?" "In the back. Just observing. Until the right moment." Richard understood immediately. A slow smile crossed his face. "You want him to think you're alone. I want him to see what he thought was true. Me, without visible support. Let him feel confident. Let him make his case. Let him think he's winning." Sarah's eyes glinted. "And then I want him to see he was wrong. About everything. That's strategic. I learn from the best." Richard reached across the table and squeezed his daughter's hand. "I'll be there. Back row. Quiet as a mouse. Until you need me. I might not need you to say anything. Just being there might be enough. Then I'll be there. Whatever you need." After dinner, Sarah drove home through the quiet Chicago streets. The city was beautiful at night, all lights and movement and possibility. She thought about tomorrow, about facing Michael across a courtroom, about finally telling her story, the real one, to someone who had the authority to make it official. She wasn't doing this out of bitterness. She'd examined her motives carefully over the past months, with the help of a therapist Catherine had recommended. Yes, she was angry. Yes, she wanted Michael to face consequences. But more than that, she wanted closure. Real closure. The kind that comes from truth being spoken aloud and acknowledged. For 15 years, she'd lived in Michael's version of their story, the one where he was a hero and she was the lucky supporting character. Tomorrow, she'd get to tell her version, and it would be the one that mattered. Michael didn't sleep the night before the trial. He lay in his mediocre bed in his mediocre apartment, staring at the ceiling, running through scenarios in his head. What would he say if the judge asked him direct questions? How would he explain the assets? How could he make himself look less pathetic than he suddenly felt? He thought about calling Vanessa. He still had her number. But pride stopped him. She'd made it clear what she thought of him. Calling her now would just confirm that he was exactly the fraud she'd accused him of being. He thought about calling his parents. But what would he say? "Hey, Mom, remember that amazing life I built? Turns out my wife built it, and I just lived in it. Oh, and I cheated on her with a woman half my age. How's retirement?" He thought about not showing up tomorrow, just disappearing, moving to another city, starting over. But that was crazy, right? He couldn't just not show up to his own divorce trial. Around 3 a.m., Michael got up and poured himself a drink. He stood at his window, much less impressive than the penthouse view he'd grown accustomed to, and forced himself to confront an uncomfortable truth. He'd been living a lie for 15 years. Not because Sarah had deceived him, but because he'd deceived himself. He wanted so badly to be successful, to be important, to be the kind of man people respected, that he'd simply decided he was that man. And when reality conflicted with that self-image, he'd ignore reality, the convenient money that was always there, the connections that opened doors a little too easily, the opportunities that fell into his lap at just the right time. He'd told himself it was luck, skill, timing. Never questioned it too deeply, because questioning it might reveal something he didn't want to see. And Sarah. Sarah. He tried to remember when he'd last really looked at her, really listened when she talked, really thought about her as a full person rather than as wife, the role she played in his life narrative. He couldn't remember. When had he stopped seeing her? Or had he ever really seen her at all? The questions haunted him until the sun came up. Michael showered, shaved, put on his best suit, which he bought on credit and still hadn't paid off. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. When had he gotten so tired? So old? He met Brad at the courthouse at 8:45 a.m. The trial was set for 9:30, but they needed to go over final strategy. Brad took one look at Michael's haggard face and grimaced. "Did you sleep?" "No." "Great. Try not to look like a zombie in there. Judges notice that stuff." "Brad, what are my chances?" "Really?" Brad was quiet for a long moment. "Of winning? 5%, maybe less. Of not looking terrible? 50-50, depending on how Catherine plays it and how well you hold up under questioning." "That's it? That's your pep talk? You want me to lie to you?" "Maybe a little." Brad almost smiled. "Okay, here's a lie. Everything's going to be fine. You're going to walk out of there with a fair settlement, and your reputation will be intact." "Thanks." "You're welcome. Now, let's go face the firing squad." They entered the courthouse together, Michael's heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The hallways were quiet, echoing with their footsteps. They found the correct courtroom, Family Court Division, Judge Harold Martinez presiding, and entered. Sarah was already there with Catherine, sitting at the plaintiff's table. She wore a simple navy dress and minimal jewelry. She looked calm, composed, and somehow more present than Michael ever remembered seeing her. She didn't look at him when he entered. The gallery was mostly empty. A few court staff, a journalist from the Tribune's legal section. Michael's stomach sank when he saw her. This was going to be public. A couple of Sarah's friends. And in the back row, barely noticeable, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit sat reading a newspaper. Michael didn't recognize Richard Morrison. They'd only met twice, over a decade ago, and Michael had barely registered him. Just another background figure in Michael's self-centered world. He didn't notice the way Sarah glanced back at her father, or the small nod Richard gave her. He didn't notice anything except his own rising panic. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Judge Martinez entered. He was in his early 60s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He looked like a man who'd heard every excuse and believed none of them. "Please be seated," Judge Martinez said. "We're here today for the divorce proceeding of Harrison versus Harrison. I've reviewed the preliminary filings from both parties." He looked over his glasses at Michael, then at Sarah. "This should be straightforward, but I understand there are some contested issues regarding asset division. Let's proceed efficiently. Ms. Chun, you may begin with your opening statement." Catherine stood, and Michael felt his last shred of hope evaporate, because he could see it in her eyes. She was about to eviscerate him. Professionally, thoroughly, publicly, and there was nothing he could do but sit there and take it. The trial was beginning, and Michael Harrison's day of reckoning had arrived. Catherine Chin stood with the controlled confidence of someone who knew she'd already won. She buttoned her suit jacket, took a breath, and began. "Your Honor, this case is very simple, despite how my opposing counsel may try to complicate it. This is not a story about a failed marriage. It's not about blame or fault. It's simply about establishing the facts. Who owns what, who contributed what, and what a fair division looks like based on those facts. She walked toward the center of the courtroom, commanding the space. Sarah Morrison Harrison came into this marriage with significant assets from her family trust. During the 15 years of marriage, she maintained those assets, managed them, grew them, and used them to create a comfortable life for both herself and her husband. The penthouse they lived in, purchased by Mrs. Harrison before the marriage, entirely with her separate funds. The investment accounts Mr. Harrison believed they were building together, opened with Mrs. Harrison's capital and maintained with distributions from her trust. The cars, the club memberships, the lifestyle they enjoyed, all funded by Mrs. Harrison. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Brad had warned him not to react, but hearing it laid out like this, so plainly, now, Mr. Harrison is not a bad person, Catherine continued, and Michael felt a surge of relief. Maybe she'd be fair. Maybe he's simply a person who benefited from his wife's generosity for 15 years and never questioned where that benefit came from. He worked hard at his career. Certainly, he earned a good salary. But, Your Honor, we will demonstrate that even that career was made possible by connections and opportunities provided by Mrs. Harrison's family. Mr. Harrison is, by all measurable standards, a man who built his life on borrowed foundation and then claimed it as his own achievement. The relief evaporated. Michael felt exposed, like everyone in the courtroom could see through to his hollow core. Mrs. Harrison is not seeking revenge. She's not seeking to punish. She simply wants what's legally hers. The asset she brought into the marriage, the asset she maintained during the marriage, and the freedom to move forward without subsidizing a man who left her for another woman after 15 years of taking her for granted. Catherine turned to look at Michael directly. This isn't complicated. Your Honor, this is a woman asking for her property back, and we will prove, beyond any doubt, that it is her property and always has been. She sat down. The courtroom was silent for a beat. Judge Martinez looked at Brad. Mr. Stevenson, your opening statement? Brad stood, and Michael could see the strain in his attorney's face. This was not a case Brad wanted to argue. Your Honor, opposing counsel paints a picture of a calculating businessman who exploited his wife. That's not accurate. Michael Harrison is a man who, like many husbands, didn't scrutinize every detail of his household finances. He trusted his wife to manage those details while he focused on his career. That's not exploitation. That's partnership. It sounded weak even to Michael's ears. Mr. Harrison did contribute to this marriage, Brad continued. He was present. He was supportive. He worked to provide for his family. The fact that his wife came from a wealthy background doesn't negate his contributions. Illinois recognizes that marriage is a partnership with both financial and non-financial contributions. We'll be arguing that Mr. Harrison deserves consideration for the 15 years he spent as Mrs. Harrison's husband, regardless of whose name is on various account documents. Brad sat down. The contrast between the two openings was stark. Catherine had been specific, fact-based, and devastating. Brad had been vague, theoretical, and defensive. Judge Martinez made some notes. Very well. Ms. Chun, call your first witness. We call Sarah Morrison Harrison to the stand. Sarah stood, smoothed her dress, and walked to the witness stand. She was sworn in, confirmed her name and address, and settled into the chair with her hands folded in her lap. She looked directly at Catherine, not at Michael. Catherine began gently. Mrs. Harrison, can you tell the court about your background? I grew up in Chicago. My father is Richard Morrison, a corporate attorney and private investor. I'm an only child. I attended private schools, then Northwestern University, where I studied art history. And your financial situation before meeting Mr. Harrison? I was a beneficiary of the Morrison Family Trust, established by my grandfather and managed by my father. The trust provided me with a monthly distribution and would eventually transfer full control to me at age 40 or upon my father's retirement, whichever came first. What was the value of that trust at the time of your marriage? Approximately $8 million. A small gasp from someone in the gallery. Michael closed his eyes. He'd never known the specific number. $8 million, before they even got married. And your employment when you met Mr. Harrison? I was working as a curator at the Newberry Gallery, a nonprofit arts organization. I made about $40,000 a year. So your primary wealth came from your family trust? Yes. Did you tell Mr. Harrison about the trust before you got married? Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. I told him my father was in law and investments. I told him I had some family money. I didn't specify amounts because he didn't ask. He talked about his career ambitions, his goals, his plans. I listened. When it came to my background, he seemed satisfied with general answers. Catherine nodded. Let's talk about the wedding. Who paid for it? My father did. The entire cost. And the honeymoon? Also my father. The penthouse you and Mr. Harrison lived in, when was that purchased? 3 months before the wedding. My father gifted it to me as a wedding present, paid in full. The deed is in my name solely. Did Mr. Harrison know this? I told him my father had help with the down payment, and that I'd put it in my name for tax reasons. He seemed fine with that arrangement and never asked for details. Catherine walked Sarah through it all. Every asset, every account, every purchase. The pattern was consistent. Sarah's money, Sarah's credit, Sarah's family connections. And each time, Sarah had told Michael some version of the truth, just not the full magnitude. And each time, Michael had accepted the explanation without digging deeper, because it suited him not to know. Mrs. Harrison, why didn't you correct your husband when he would talk about our home, or our investments, or our success? Sarah was quiet for a moment, at first because it felt petty. It was our home in the sense that we lived there together. It was our life together. The financial details didn't seem to matter when we were happy. Later, because I realized he needed the narrative. He needed to feel like he'd built something. And I thought, what's the harm? I had plenty. Letting him feel successful didn't cost me anything. She paused, her voice tightening slightly. I was wrong about that. It did cost me something. It cost me being seen. Can you explain that? When someone takes credit for building the life you actually built, and you let them do it to be kind, they start to believe it. And then they start to believe you contributed nothing, that you were just there, lucky to be included in their success story. Sarah finally looked at Michael. I wanted a partnership. I got to be an extra in his movie. The courtroom was silent. Even Judge Martinez had stopped taking notes and was just listening. Catherine let that sit for a moment, then continued. Mrs. Harrison, during your marriage, did you work? For the first 7 years, I worked at the gallery. Then I shifted to full-time volunteer work and managing my investments. Managing the investments was work. Yes, I spent 20 to 30 hours a week researching opportunities, meeting with advisors, rebalancing portfolios. The trust grew from $8 million to approximately $14 million during the marriage. More gasps. Michael felt sick, and Mr. Harrison's career. Can you speak to that? Michael is smart and hardworking. I don't want to diminish that. But his first job at Brennan and Associates came because my father called the CEO personally and recommended him. His first major client was someone I introduced him to. Several other key connections throughout his career came through my family's network. He earned his promotions through his own work, but the opportunities to earn those promotions were facilitated. Did Mr. Harrison know this? I don't know. I never explicitly told him, but I didn't hide it either. The information was there if he cared to look at how doors were opening for him. Catherine nodded. Last question, Mrs. Harrison. What do you want from this divorce? I want my property. The penthouse, the accounts, the investments, everything that was mine before the marriage and remained mine during it. I want it legally confirmed so there's no ambiguity going forward. Do you want spousal support from Mr. Harrison? No. Do you want any of his assets, his retirement account, his salary? No. He can keep what he actually earned. Thank you, Mrs. Harrison. Catherine sat down. Judge Martinez looked at Brad. Cross-examination? This was Brad's chance to poke holes in Sarah's testimony, to make her look cold or calculating, to suggest she deliberately deceived Michael. But as Brad stood and approached the witness stand, He looked like a man who knew he was about to make things worse, not better. Mrs. Harrison. Brad began carefully. You testified that you told your husband about your family's money in general terms, but you admit you didn't tell him the specific amounts. He didn't ask. Isn't it true that by keeping that information vague, you created a situation where Mr. Harrison couldn't fully understand financial dynamics of your marriage? I created a situation where Michael could ask questions if he was curious. He never was. Brad frowned. Mrs. Harrison, isn't it true that you managed all the household finances? Yes. And that you kept Mr. Harrison, let's say, uninformed about the details? I kept records. I filed taxes jointly, which he signed. I provided statements if he asked. He never asked. Because he trusted you. Or because he wasn't interested in details that might complicate his narrative. Brad's jaw tightened. Mrs. Harrison, do you love my client? Objection, Catherine said. Relevance. Your Honor, I'm trying to establish the emotional context of this marriage. Judge Martinez considered. I'll allow it, but make your point, Mr. Stevenson. Brad turned back to Sarah. Do you love Mr. Harrison? Sarah took a breath. I love the man I thought he was. The man I thought might eventually see me as an equal partner. But no, I don't love the man who left me for a woman half his age and then tried to take half of assets he never owned. So this is about revenge. No, this is about honesty. For the first time in 15 years, Michael is hearing the truth about our life together. If that feels like revenge to him, that says more about him than about me. Brad was losing this exchange badly, and he knew it. He tried another angle. Mrs. Harrison, you keep referring to your property and your money, but you were married. Don't you think there's something to be said for the idea that spouses share in each other's success? Absolutely. If Michael had ever acknowledged that any success in his life was shared, I'd agree. But he didn't. He claimed it was all his. So now we're going back and establishing whose it actually was. And it turns out Sarah's voice was firm now. It was mine. The house was mine. The money was mine. The connections were mine. The foundation everything was built on was mine. Michael lived in it, benefited from it, and took credit for it. But it was always mine. Brad knew when to quit. No further questions. Sarah stepped down from the witness stand and returned to her seat. Catherine touched her arm briefly, a silent acknowledgement. Sarah had been perfect, calm, clear, and undeniable. Judge Martinez checked his watch. Ms. Chun, your next witness? We have several witnesses prepared to testify regarding specific assets and Mr. Harrison's career trajectory. However, if the court will permit a brief recess, I believe we may have an additional witness who could provide valuable context. Michael's heart sank. Who else could they possibly bring in? His boss? His colleagues? Some accountant to further detail how broke he really was? Judge Martinez nodded. 15-minute recess. We'll reconvene at... Your Honor. A voice from the back of the courtroom. Deep, calm, authoritative. Everyone turned. The silver-haired man from the back row was standing. With permission, Your Honor. Michael squinted. There was something familiar about that voice, that bearing, but he couldn't place it. Some expert witness Catherine had planned? Judge Martinez looked surprised. I'm sorry, sir. Do you have business with this court? I believe I might, Your Honor. My name is Richard Morrison. I'm Mrs. Harrison's father. The room seemed to freeze. Michael's brain short-circuited. That was Sarah's father? That man in the back, who he'd barely noticed, who he'd dismissed 15 years ago as some boring retired lawyer. That was Richard Morrison? Judge Martinez's expression changed immediately. Mr. Morrison, I wasn't aware you were in attendance. I prefer to observe quietly, Your Honor, but I think there may be some context I can provide that would expedite these proceedings. Catherine stood. Your Honor, Mr. Morrison wasn't on my witness list, but if the court would allow... You're Richard Morrison. Judge Martinez was staring. From Morrison Capital Partners? I am. I took a seminar you taught at Northwestern Law School 20 years ago on corporate acquisition strategies. I remember that seminar. You asked some very sharp questions. Richard smiled slightly. You've done well for yourself, Harold. Michael watched this exchange in mounting horror. His wife's father, the man he thought was a nobody, was not only wealthy, but apparently so prominent that the judge recognized him and seemed almost starstruck. Mr. Morrison, Judge Martinez said, if you have testimony that's relevant to these proceedings, I'll hear it. Mr. Stevenson, any objection? Brad looked at Michael, who was pale and sweating. No objection, Your Honor, Brad said weakly. What else could he say? Very well. Mr. Morrison, please approach the bench and be sworn in. Richard Morrison walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. He moved with unhurried confidence, the kind that comes from decades of being the most powerful person in any room. He was sworn in, stated his name and profession for the record, and settled into the witness stand like he owned it. Michael felt like he was going to be sick. This couldn't be happening. This was supposed to be him versus Sarah. A he said, she said about a failed marriage. Instead, it was turning into a public execution, and the executioner had just taken the stand. Mr. Morrison, Catherine began, thank you for testifying. Can you describe your professional background for the record? I'm a corporate attorney by training. I specialized in mergers and acquisitions for 30 years before transitioning to private investing. I founded Morrison Capital Partners in 1998. We focus on early-stage tech investments and corporate restructuring. I've served on the boards of 17 companies, 16 of which went public or were successfully acquired. I retired from active practice in 2009 to focus on philanthropy and selective investment. And your net worth? Approximately $280 million, give or take depending on market conditions. The number hung in the air. Michael heard it, but couldn't process it. $280 million. Sarah's father was worth $280 million, and Michael had thought he was just some regular retired lawyer. How had he missed that? Mr. Morrison, the Morrison Family Trust that's been referenced. Can you explain that? My father established it in 1962. It's grown through strategic investments over 3 generations. My daughter Sarah is the primary beneficiary. Upon my retirement or her 40th birthday, whichever comes first, she assumes full control, currently worth approximately $14 million. And the penthouse where Sarah and Mr. Harrison lived, I purchased it in 2011 as a wedding gift for my daughter. Title was placed exclusively in her name, per my instructions. I wanted to ensure she always had security independent of her marriage. Why was that important to you? Richard was silent for a moment, choosing his words. Because I've seen too many intelligent women made financially vulnerable by marriages to men who underestimate them. I want to make sure my daughter never had to stay in a relationship out of financial necessity. Did Mr. Harrison know you purchased the penthouse? Sarah told him I contributed to it. I don't know what details she provided beyond that. Catherine nodded. Mr. Morrison, do you know the defendant, Michael Harrison? We've met twice. Once at a dinner before their engagement, and once at a brunch before the wedding. What was your impression of him? Brad half rose. Objection, relevance. I'll allow it, Judge Martinez said. Mr. Morrison, please proceed. Richard looked directly at Michael for the first time. His gaze was measuring, neither hostile nor warm. Just assessing. I thought he was ambitious, articulate, confident, perhaps overly so. He spoke at length about his career plans and his vision for success. He asked me no questions about my work or my daughter's interests. He seemed to view Sarah as an accessory to his planned trajectory. Michael wanted to object, to defend himself, but he was frozen. Did you approve of the marriage? Catherine asked. I trusted my daughter's judgment. She wanted to marry him, and I respected that. But I also took precautions to ensure she'd be protected if the marriage didn't work out, hence the trust structure and the property arrangements. Did you help Mr. Harrison professionally? Yes, at Sarah's request. I made several calls on his behalf early in his career. I introduced him to contacts, recommended him for positions, facilitated meetings that helped him advance. Sarah believed in him and wanted him to succeed. And did Mr. Harrison know you facilitated these opportunities? I don't know what Sarah told him. I didn't do it for gratitude. I did it because my daughter asked me to help her husband. Catherine smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. No further questions." Brad stood for cross-examination, but he looked like a man facing a firing squad. Still, he had to try. "Mr. Morrison, isn't it true that you never liked my client?" "I neither liked nor disliked him. I barely knew him. But you just testified that you thought he was overly confident and viewed your daughter as an accessory." "I said that was my impression from 2 brief meetings 15 years ago. I could have been wrong. Though given that he's now divorcing my daughter for a younger woman while trying to claim assets he didn't earn, perhaps I wasn't." The courtroom was completely silent, except for a strangled sound from Michael. Brad tried again. "Mr. Morrison, isn't your testimony here today motivated by a desire to protect your daughter's inheritance?" "My testimony is motivated by a desire to establish facts. Sarah's inheritance was never in question. It's legally protected and always has been. This trial is merely making public what was always true. My daughter funded a life Michael Harrison enjoyed. She did it quietly, generously, without seeking credit. And in return, he credited himself, diminished her, and eventually betrayed her." Richard's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "I'm simply here to make sure the record is clear." Brad had no response. No further questions. Richard Morrison stepped down from the witness stand. As he walked back toward his seat, he passed directly by Michael. For just a moment, their eyes met. Richard's expression was unreadable. Then he returned to the back row, sitting down as quietly as he'd been before. But everything had changed. Michael wasn't just facing Sarah anymore. He was facing the full weight of the Morrison family. And in that moment, sitting in that courtroom, Michael Harrison finally understood the magnitude of what he'd done. He'd married a woman he never bothered to really know. He'd built a life on her foundation and claimed it as his own. He'd dismissed her father as insignificant without ever asking a single question about who he really was. And now, in open court, with a judge watching and a journalist recording, the truth was being laid bare. He was not the self-made man. He was not the successful executive who'd built an empire. He was a man who'd been given everything and mistaken it for achievement. And there was no coming back from that. After Richard Morrison's testimony, the trial continued with additional witnesses. But everyone in the courtroom knew it was over. Catherine called a forensic accountant who walked through every asset in excruciating detail. She called a business associate of Richard's who confirmed that Michael's first major job came through a direct call from Morrison Capital Partners. She called one of Sarah's friends who testified about seeing Michael publicly belittle Sarah at social events. Each piece of testimony was another nail in the coffin. Brad tried to mount a defense. He called Michael to the stand to testify about his contributions to the marriage. It went poorly. "Mr. Harrison," his own attorney asked him gently, "can you tell the court about your career achievements?" Michael straightened his shoulders, trying to summon some of his old confidence. "I worked my way up from an entry-level position to vice president at Brennan & Associates. I've closed major deals, built client relationships, earned every promotion through hard work." "With respect," Catherine interrupted during cross-examination, "isn't it true that your initial position at Brennan & Associates came through a direct referral from Richard Morrison?" Yes. He made an introduction, but I earned the job." "And your first major client, the Henderson account? That came from a woman Sarah introduced you to at a charity gala, correct?" "Yes, but—" "And the capital you used to start your side business in 2016, the business that failed after 11 months, that was from Sarah's trust, wasn't it?" "She said it was from our savings." "Mr. Harrison, did you ever look at a bank statement? Did you ever ask where the money in your savings came from?" Michael's face was red. "I trusted my wife to manage our finances." "Or you didn't ask questions because the answers might have complicated the story you were telling yourself." "Objection." Brad called, argumentative. "Sustained," Judge Martinez said, but the damage was done. The worst moment came when Brad tried to argue that Michael had contributed to the marriage through emotional support and partnership. Catherine asked a single question during her cross-examination. "Mr. Harrison, when did you last tell your wife you loved her before you asked for a divorce?" Michael opened his mouth. closed it, tried to remember. We said it sometimes. On birthdays, anniversaries. Can you remember a specific instance in the year before you filed for divorce? Silence. Michael's mind was blank. Had he said it? He must have. But when? In what context? He couldn't remember. Mr. Harrison, when did you last ask your wife about her day and listen to her full answer? We talked every day. About what? About household things, schedules, plans. Did you ever ask about her volunteer work, her investment management, her interests? She never seemed to want to talk about those things. Or you never asked in a way that made her feel you actually care about the answer? Michael had no response. As the afternoon wore on, Michael's humiliation became complete. Every claim he'd made about his life was systematically dismantled. Every achievement he'd been proud of was revealed to have an asterisk. And through it all, Sarah sat calmly at her table, not gloating, not angry, just present, witnessing the truth finally being spoken aloud. The final witness Catherine called was a colleague of Michael's who reluctantly testified that at office gatherings, Michael had often made jokes about how Sarah had it easy because she didn't have a real career. The witness looked uncomfortable delivering the testimony, but Catherine had his deposition, and he couldn't back out. Did Mr. Harrison ever mention that his wife managed a multi-million-dollar investment portfolio? Catherine asked. No, he said she did volunteer work. Did he ever mention that the home he lived in was owned entirely by his wife? No, he called it his place when he invited people over. Did he ever acknowledge any of the contributions Mrs. Harrison made to their life together? The colleague looked at Michael apologetically. Not that I remember. He talked about Sarah like she was, I don't know, a nice wife who kept things organized at home so he could focus on work. Michael wanted to disappear. That was it, wasn't it? That was exactly how he thought of Sarah. A nice wife, supportive, helpful, background, never the main character, never the architect of the entire life he'd been living. By 4:30 p.m., both sides had rested their cases. Judge Martinez called a brief recess to review his notes before delivering his ruling. Michael sat with Brad in the hallway during the recess. Other cases were cycling through the courtroom, but they'd been told to stay nearby. The ruling could come any time in the next hour. That was bad, Michael said quietly. Yes, Brad agreed. There was no point in sugarcoating it anymore. What's it going to rule? Sarah gets everything she's asking for. The penthouse, the accounts, full ownership of all assets she came into the marriage with. You'll get essentially nothing. Maybe your personal retirement account that was funded by your actual salary. Your car if you can prove you made the payments, though I suspect those came from the joint account that was funded by Sarah's trust. So I walk away with nothing. Michael's voice was hollow. You walk away with your job and the ability to rebuild. That's not nothing. But materially, yes, you'll leave this marriage with less than you came in with because you accumulated debt thinking you could afford a lifestyle you actually couldn't. Brad paused. Michael, I tried to warn you. I tried to get you to settle. I know. This is going to be public record. The journalist from the Tribune is here. This is going to be a story. Executive discovers he's been living off wife's fortune for 15 years. It's not going to be kind. Michael put his head in his hands. What do? You accept the ruling with dignity. You don't argue. You don't make excuses. You say, yes, Your Honor, and you move on with your life. And then you figure out who you actually are when you're not living in someone else's house. At 5:15 p.m., they were called back into the courtroom. Everyone took their seats. Sarah looked composed as ever. Catherine looked satisfied. Richard Morrison was still in the back row, still quietly observing. Judge Martinez entered, and everyone rose. When they were seated again, the judge began speaking. I reviewed all testimony and evidence presented today. This is actually one of the clearer cases I've seen in family court. Despite the initial complexity, Michael's heart sank. Clear meant bad for him. The evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates that Mrs. Sarah Morrison Harrison entered this marriage with substantial separate property, maintained that property throughout the marriage, and used her separate funds to enhance the couple's lifestyle. Mr. Michael Harrison contributed his salary to the household, but by his own admission, did not carefully track where other funds came from or how major assets were titled. Judge Martinez looked directly at Michael. Mr. Harrison, I want to be clear. This ruling is not a judgment on your character or your worth as a person, but this is a court of law. And in law, ownership is determined by documentation, not by assumption. The documentation in this case is crystal clear. The penthouse is Mrs. Harrison's separate property. The investment accounts are Mrs. Harrison's separate property. Even many of the household furnishings were purchased with funds traceable to Mrs. Harrison's trust. Michael felt each word like a physical blow. Furthermore, the testimony today demonstrated that many of the career opportunities Mr. Harrison benefited from came through Mrs. Harrison's family connections. While Mr. Harrison certainly worked hard to capitalize on those opportunities, the opportunities themselves were not independently earned. Judge Martinez paused, reviewing his notes. Illinois is an equitable distribution state, which means marital property is divided fairly, not necessarily equally. However, this requires that we first identify what is actually marital property. In this case, the vast majority of assets are Mrs. Harrison's separate property and not subject to division. Therefore, my ruling is as follows. All property titled in Mrs. Harrison's name, including the penthouse at 2450 Lincoln Park West, all investment accounts held in her name or in a Morrison Family Trust, and all assets purchased with funds from said trust are confirmed as Mrs. Harrison's separate property and remain solely with her. Mr. Harrison is awarded the following: his personal retirement account from his employment at Brennan & Associates, his personal vehicle if he can demonstrate he made the payments from his salary, and any personal property that can be confirmed as purchased solely with his earnings. No spousal support is awarded to either party. The marriage is dissolved. Both parties are free to remarry. Judge Martinez looked up. Mr. Harrison, do you understand this ruling? Michael's throat was dry. He had to force the words out. Yes, Your Honor. Mrs. Harrison? Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. Then this court is adjourned. The clerk will prepare the final divorce decree for signatures. Judge Martinez stood and left the courtroom. It was over. Just like that. 15 years of marriage dissolved in a few hours of testimony and a 5-minute ruling. Michael sat frozen in his seat while Brad packed up his briefcase. Around them, people were standing, gathering their things, filtering out courtroom. Catherine and Sarah stood together, speaking quietly. Sarah glanced once at Michael, and for just a moment, their eyes met. He wanted to say something. Apologize? Explain? But what was there to say? Sorry I took you for granted for 15 years? Sorry I never bothered to learn who you really were? Sorry I claimed your life as mine? Sarah looked away first. She and Catherine left through the side door, Richard Morrison following a few steps behind. The journalist was already typing notes into her phone. Other witnesses were leaving. Within minutes, the courtroom was nearly empty. Come on, Brad said gently. Let's go. Michael stood on shaky legs and followed his attorney out of the courtroom. The hallway was bright and busy with other cases, other dramas. Nobody looked at him. Nobody cared. He was just another failed marriage, another man who'd overestimated his position and paid the price. Outside the courthouse, the spring air was cool and fresh. Brad shook Michael's hand. Good luck, Michael. Sincerely. Thanks for everything. I'll send you my final invoice. Given the ruling, I'll try to keep it reasonable. Michael almost laughed. Reasonable. What a concept. He nodded, and Brad walked away, leaving Michael standing on the courthouse steps alone. His phone buzzed. A text from his boss. Need to talk. Tomorrow morning, my office. That couldn't be good. Word must be spreading already. He could almost write the script. The firm wouldn't want the bad publicity. They'd suggest he resign, or they'd quietly push him out. Either way, his career, the one thing he thought was genuinely his, was probably over too. Michael walked to the parking garage where he'd left his car, the leased Tesla that he now realized he couldn't afford to keep. He sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine, and finally, for the first time all day, let himself feel the full weight of what had happened. He'd lost everything. Not because it was taken from him, but because it was never his to begin with. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Michael Harrison was living in a one-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood 40 minutes from downtown. He'd lost his job at Brennan and Associates, though they let him resign to pursue other opportunities. His reputation in the Chicago business community was damaged enough that finding equivalent work was impossible. He'd eventually found a position at a much smaller marketing firm, making about 60% of his old salary. It was a humbling step down, but it was something. He drove a used Honda Civic. He shopped at discount grocery stores. He lived within his actual means for the first time in his adult life. The Tribune article had been brutal but fair. The self-made man who wasn't. A cautionary tale about marriage and money. It detailed the trial, the revelations, the ruling. Michael's name was now permanently associated with being a cautionary tale. When he Googled himself, which he'd stopped doing after the first month, that article was the first result. Vanessa had texted once after the trial, "I hope you're okay." He hadn't responded. What would be the point? She'd seen the truth and left. She'd been smarter than he'd given her credit for. His parents had been supportive in their confused, disappointed way. They didn't fully understand what had happened, just that their son had gotten divorced and his life had fallen apart. They offered to let him move back to Indianapolis, but Michael declined. Running away wouldn't help. On a random Saturday in October, Michael was at a coffee shop, a cheap one, not the artisanal places he used to frequent, when he saw Sarah. She was across the street, coming out of an art gallery, laughing with a group of people. She looked happy, lighter. She was wearing jeans and a casual sweater, her hair pulled back simply. She looked like herself in a way Michael realized he'd never really seen when they were married. A man was with her. Tall, maybe 45, casually dressed. He said something that made Sarah laugh, and she touched his arm briefly. The gesture was easy, comfortable. They walked together down the street, part of a larger group heading somewhere for lunch or coffee. Michael watched from inside the shop, hidden by the reflection on the window. He felt something complicated. Not jealousy exactly. More like grief. For the relationship they could have had if he'd ever actually paid attention, if he'd ever asked questions, if he'd ever seen her as a person rather than as a supporting character in his life story. She disappeared around a corner, and Michael turned back to his laptop, where he'd been working on a project for his new job. It was routine work, unglamorous, but it was his, earned by his actual effort. There was something clarifying about that, even if it was humbling. He'd started seeing a therapist 2 months ago. It was covered by his new job's decent, but not luxurious health insurance. The therapist, Dr. Patel, had been helping him work through what she called a prolonged narcissistic delusion. Those weren't kind words, but they were accurate. Michael had spent 15 years living in a story where he was the protagonist, the hero, the success. Everyone else, including his wife, were just supporting roles. The question, Dr. Patel had said in their last session, is who are you when you're not the hero? When you're just a person trying to live honestly. Michael was still figuring that out, but for the first time, he was actually trying to figure it out rather than just inventing a flattering answer. Sarah's life after the divorce had blossomed in ways she hadn't expected. The relief of no longer carrying the weight of Michael's obliviousness was profound. She'd returned to work at a different gallery, this time in a leadership role. She'd increased her philanthropic work, using her resources to fund arts programs in underserved schools. She'd reconnected with old friends and made new ones. And yes, she'd started dating. Nothing serious yet. The man Michael had seen her with was actually just a friend, a fellow board member of one of the foundations she supported. But she was open to possibilities in a way she hadn't been for years. The most significant change was in her relationship with her father. They'd always been close, but the divorce had brought them even closer. They had dinner together twice a week now. They talked about everything: investments, politics, art, life. Richard had started teaching Sarah some of the more intricate aspects of corporate investing, preparing her for when she'd take full control of the trust in a few years. "You handled that trial with incredible grace," Richard had told her a few weeks after it ended. "I just told the truth. That's harder than people think, especially when the truth makes you vulnerable." Sarah had thought about that. I don't feel vulnerable anymore, Dad. I feel free. And she did. The divorce had been painful, but it had also been clarifying. For 15 years, she'd made herself smaller to accommodate Michael's need to feel big. She'd stayed quiet to let him have his narrative. She'd subsidized his ego along with his lifestyle. And in doing so, she'd lost herself a little. Getting divorced meant finding herself again, remembering that she was smart, capable, and valuable not because of who she was married to, but because of who she actually was. The daughter of Richard Morrison, yes, but also her own person with her own strengths and her own story. She didn't hate Michael. That surprised people when she said it. They expected bitterness, anger, vindictiveness. But she just felt done. He'd taken 15 years of her life, yes, but she'd given them willingly. The lesson was learned. The chapter was closed. It was time for the next one. One evening, Sarah was at her father's house for dinner when he asked her an unexpected question. Do you regret marrying him? Sarah considered it carefully. No, I regret staying as long as I did. I regret making myself invisible. But the marriage itself, it taught me what I don't want. That's valuable information. What do you want? A partner, an actual partner. Someone who sees me, knows me, values me. Someone who'd never let me disappear because my presence is too important to them. She smiled. You raised me to know my worth. I just had to remember it. Richard reached across the table and squeezed her hand. I'm proud of you, not for the divorce, for how you handled it. With dignity and honesty, I learned from the best. They finished dinner, and as Sarah was leaving, she paused at the door. Dad, do you think he ever loved me? Really, Richard was quiet for a moment. I think Michael Harrison loved the idea of you, a beautiful, supportive wife who made his life easy. But did he love you, the real, complex, brilliant woman you are? I don't think he ever knew you well enough to love that version. And that's his loss, not yours. Sarah nodded. That made sense. That felt true. She hugged her father and drove home through the city she'd always loved. Chicago at night was beautiful, full of lights and possibility. She had her whole life ahead of her, a life that was genuinely hers, built on her own terms, with no one taking credit for things they didn't earn. It was a good life. It was going to be a great life. And Michael Harrison was just a footnote now, a lesson learned and left behind. The story of Michael and Sarah Harrison became something of a legend in Chicago legal circles. Lawyers use it as a cautionary tale in divorce proceedings. The case was cited in several law journals about separate property and asset division. The Tribune article got shared thousands of times on social media, spawning countless think pieces about gender, money, and assumptions in marriage. People took sides. Some sympathized with Michael, arguing he was a victim of his own naivety. Others saw him as the epitome of male entitlement, a man who took credit for his wife's work and was shocked when called out. The truth, as usual, was somewhere in the complicated middle. But the core lesson was clear. When you build your life on assumptions rather than truth, when you take credit for things you didn't earn, when you treat your partner as a supporting character rather than an equal author of your shared story, eventually reality catches up. And when it does, the reckoning is painful and public and unavoidable. Michael Harrison learned that the hard way. He'd spent 15 years living in a borrowed life, thinking it was his, and when the Real owner asked for it back, he had nothing left. He'd been a vice president, a successful executive, a man with a luxury penthouse and expensive tastes, and all of it, every single piece, had been built on someone else's foundation, starting over at 42 years old with no assets, a damaged reputation. And the knowledge that your entire adult life was a lie? That's a hard place to start from. But it was the only honest place Michael had ever been. And maybe, just maybe, that honesty would lead him somewhere real. Somewhere he'd actually earned the right to stand. Sarah, for a part, became something of a quiet inspiration. She didn't give interviews or write a tell-all book. She just lived her life, generously, intelligently, on her own terms. She proved that you don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to know your worth and be willing to stand up for it when the moment comes. And Richard Morrison? He went back to being exactly what he'd always been, a powerful man who preferred to work behind the scenes, support his daughter, making strategic investments, and living by the principle he'd always taught Sarah. Let your actions speak, never your wallet. The final image is this: a courtroom in Chicago on a spring morning. A man who thought he'd won everything, suddenly realizing he'd never had anything. A woman who'd been silent for 15 years, finally speaking her truth. And a father in the back row, watching his daughter stand up for herself, ready to support her, but letting her fight her own battle. Because that's what real strength looks like. Not dominance, not control, not claiming credit you didn't earn, but knowing who you are, what you're worth, and being willing to stand alone if necessary, while knowing you're never really alone if you built genuine relationships based on truth rather than convenience. Michael learned that too late. Sarah learned it just in time, and that made all the difference.